Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Gossard. I'm Vice President of Republicans Overseas, and John Richardson and I are on today. We want to continue this conversation we've been having the last few weeks, talking about Republicans Overseas position on taxation of overseas Americans. And we've clarified this in the last two or three podcasts that we've had, um, and what we mean by pure RBT. And, John, a lot of people uh, still want to know, there's a lot of confusion in terms of FATCA, how it plays into this whole subject, and how FATCA and CBT both cause separate issues, but they're really different things, aren't they? I mean, maybe you could clarify what exactly is the difference and what the issues are there.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. A great question and very important question. When I, look at the social media stuff and the conversation that's going on, there's clearly tremendous confusion, or maybe there isn't, but there's a tendency for people to use the word FATCA as somehow, what the real problem is here. And it is a problem, but it is not the same as CBT, citizenship-based taxation. And I think it's important for people to understand the difference because if you get rid of FATCA, say this could be done, doesn't make much difference because you still have to deal with the citizenship-based taxation. If, on the other hand, you were able to get rid of citizenship taxation and move to a pure RBT, meaning where citizenship could not be used to pin tax residence on American citizens, then the FATCA problem should vanish for overseas Americans. Now, what's the difference between these two things? The rules of citizenship tax they determine exactly how people are taxed, what their income is, how it's taxed, what are the rules, what are the reporting rules, all that kind of stuff. And incidentally, for those who aren't aware of this, the way the US tax system works is that not only does it tax American citizens who leave the United States to live in another country, but it actually imposes a far more punitive and vicious tax system on them than if they were living on the United States, for the very simple reason that obviously the assets, the income, the lives of Americans overseas are foreign. And the United States is very, very hostile to anything that is foreign. But that's different from FATCA. What FATCA is basically a reporting requirement from the point of view of Americans, that they have to file forms detailing all their assets to the IRS. And interestingly, this issue was just raised domestically, and I think it's still going on. Resident Americans are complaining about information about their bank accounts going directly to the IRS. Yet, the simple FATCA, or fact of the matter, is that since 2010, when FATCA was enacted, overseas Americans have been subjected to exactly the same thing. Now, if you were to get
That's a
rid of
good point,
FATCA,
John. If I can jump in for a moment, I want to take you off your subject here, but yeah, FATCA really did in many ways kind of foreshadow that proposal that Americans domestically, that the same kind of reporting be done on domestic Americans. I mean, how close were those two, John? And it does seem to some extent that FATCA did foreshadow that whole proposal coming out of the administration today to really invasively seek the banking information for all Americans domestically as well as those living abroad.
that is absolutely correct, Jim. And I have been saying for years that all resident Americans need to do to see their future is to house the United States government treats Americans abroad. It's as though Americans abroad are the incubator, to see how different kinds of things work. And what I find astounding is that the likely outcome of this, at least for now, is that resident Americans, those who live in the United States, will not have their bank accounts reported to the IRS, yet somehow US citizens with no connection to the United States, totally non-US income, are subject to a system where their bank accounts are reported directly to the IRS. I mean, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. But there's a second problem here, okay? And that is that Americans overseas are now being routinely denied bank accounts because they're Americans. And this is because basically these banks do not want to be sanctioned by the US government for not being able to, one, identify people with the US birthplace and get them to cooperate, providing information that can then be turned over to the IRS. I mean, it's an amazing thing. So fact is, but notice that none of these things, the reporting to the IRS, the banking account availability, this doesn't affect the actual tax situation. So even, looking at something like this same country exemption nonsense, okay, even if you were to somehow able to get rid of the FATCA for Americans overseas, you're still left right there with a citizenship
sure.
tax problem. And Jim, you and I were, involved in that 2017 Meadows hearing.
Oh, yeah.
I will
Yeah,
never
very heavily.
forget
It's amazing.
when the Democrats' witness, Elise Bean, actually had the temerity to suggest that rather than get rid of FATCA for overseas Americans, this is the first time I heard this suggestion, that it would be a good idea to impose that same thing on resident Americans. Do you remember hearing that?
John, I remember that hearing room was quite filled. You and I were both, well, and probably those of the people who listen to this podcast know the subject matter very well. But for those of you that aren't aware, those hearings that were held in April of 2017 were conducted very much at the request of Republicans overseas. John, you and I and a few others, neither of us testified, but we prepared the panel. It took us a year to
We
prepare the
spent
panel.
1 year for listeners. Jim
Yeah.
and I met weekly for 1 year, right?
Yeah.
Preparing for that hearing. It was unbelievable what went into
That's
that.
right. Yeah, on another podcast, we could probably go into some more depth on those hearings. Really was quite extraordinary. But, John, not only will I never forget that hearing room was packed to the gills with people that really knew that subject matter. They weren't there as tourists. They were to hear exactly what those hearings were going to be all about. I will never forget the audible gasp in the entire hearing room when the discussion went back and forth from Chairman Meadows to Jim Bopp and then to Elise Bean. And she said, no, this is not just like a 1099, which is what she tried to get away with. Remember that explaining initially is no,
Yeah.
FATCA is no more invasive than a 1099. Well, she really finally admitted that what they would really like to see would be such a requirement imposed domestically. And I'll never forget how the audience, a lot of tax experts in that room, a lot of Fourth Amendment people in that room. And the gasp in the audience was, I'll never forget it. It was audible. Everybody would remember that.
It was shocking. It was absolutely shocking, but it did portend the reality of what they are, as far as I can tell, they're still trying to get this, this thing in domestically. And, again, all resident Americans need to do to see their future is just to look what's happening to Americans overseas. And it is in the interests of residents Americans to start getting interested in this because, their rights of privacy, their liberties, their dignity as individuals, step by step, it's being taken away by the US government. And this is just one more example of it. And Republicans overseas has been absolutely correct in pushing back on this stuff since 2014, the original FATCA lawsuit, the Meadows hearings, contribution to the holding bill that came out in 2018, and now back again with an endorsement of pure RBT.
Yeah, and it's why we got re-involved in the subject, John. Yeah, sure. And then of course we had the repeal FATCA legislation that was introduced by. Remember we worked with Senator Rand Paul.
Yes.
And then Congressman Meadows were the two that introduced the repeal FATCA legislation. But yeah, it is why we've gotten re-engaged in the issue. It is a very serious issue. The fact that the rights of Americans domestically, we don't know really where that stands, whether the administration is going to try to push through the invasive reporting requirement on Americans domestic. Don't know where that stands right now, whether it's in the
But
bill or
Jim,
not.
I think that we can agree that the Biden administration is actively trying to get that. We would
Yes.
agree on that, right?
Yeah, for sure. And it's why we have to be so firm on what we mean by pure RBT. This is not something we can advocate a watered down version of this. The stakes are very high for all Americans. Certainly the stakes are high for all Americans living abroad now. But we can see where they want to take this, and it's incredibly invasive, and we just got to push back. So it's once again, it gets back to that why pure RBT, what do we mean by it? And we can't allow that, we can't advocate for a position that doesn't call for rejecting CBT and going to a pure RBT system.
Jim, you're absolutely right on that, because any remedial proposal that leaves CBT intact in any way, shape, or form, essentially, without further remedial provisions, leaves all the principles of FATCA intact as well.
It does.
To repeat, if you can go to pure RBT, you solve the FATCA problem for overseas Americans. But there's nothing about solving the FATCA problem for overseas Americans that makes CBT go away. CBT is the original sin, the root of all fiscal evil. And a move to pure RBT will solve the problems for all overseas Americans, all of these people, all of the time, full stop. And that's why it is essential for all interested individuals to advocate for that.
Maybe that's a good place to wrap, John. That's that excellent, to hammer home that point. Maybe that's a good good point to wrap for this week. We're into it for about 10 minutes.
Absolutely.
John, thanks for your commitment to this and for your expertise as always. There are, I would say there's no one in the world that understands this subject to your level of expertise. And it's great to be working with you on this issue that is so important for overseas Americans.
Well, on behalf of everybody, I certainly thank RO, Republicans Overseas, for their commitment to this cause.
Thank you, John.